Well, welcome back to the main sessions. I hope you found the breakout rooms useful, and thanks very much to our breakout presenters. Now, next up, we have a session with our silver sponsor, Cleveland Steel and Tubes, on the distinct difference between recycling and reuse, and how reuse can make a big contribution to cutting carbon. Managing Director Roy Fishwick will be taking live questions after this presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Roy Fishwick. I'm the Managing Director of Cleveland Steel and Tubes, and I'm here to do a presentation on the steel reuse and the opportunities to reduce carbon in construction. It's something I've been involved with now for over 10 years, with sustainability in mind specifically, and in regards of steel tubes, I've been going for far too many, 30 years approximately. It's very much the case that this has become a hot topic. I've seen huge movement in the marketplace just in the last 6 months. But in the first instance, why would we choose to reuse? Well, the obvious answer is carbon, and that is to do with the global climate emergency. It's very much on the focus of everybody's agendas nationally, never mind construction. You've got net zero 2050 targets, which have intermediate targets for 2030. A lot of these are now being passed through into industry, and construction are seeing these targets. Steel production are seeing these targets. Construction is very relevant because it accounts for such a huge amount of the carbon, relatively speaking, for UK and global industry. So if we can make the gains in construction, it has a very significant impact globally on reducing carbon. Embodied carbon is also very important. This is slightly at conflict with net zero. Net zero tends to focus on energy consumption, for want of a better way of putting it. We do have to be careful that by creating a low carbon use environment, we haven't created a high embodied carbon environment, i.e. we're not using far more carbon to create the solution than the problem or the answer that we're presenting. In that regard, I'm a big advocate of the circular economy, which means that we need to look at how we're benefiting the climate and carbon situation now, but what impact that will have going forward. And of course, circularity and reuse are inextricably linked. But we definitely don't want to hit all the targets for 2050 to find out we've created a disaster by 2051. And if all of that hasn't turned you on, then at the end of the day, the biggest reason you may end up engaging with reuse, circular economy and carbon targets is because your customers are telling you you're going to have to. In terms of steel, which is my expertise, can we reuse? And in very simple analysis, the answer is yes. The construction product regulations allow for it. One of the 7 tenets of the regulations is sustainability. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's not a developed guideline as you would expect for engineering. It's actually a principle. So we are supposed to try to be sustainable, is about as helpful as that is. In terms of tubulars, for me, the biggest thing has been in piling industry currently, which has made a big issue of reuse for years based on price. And the Eurocodes for piling specifically allow for reused material and for a protocol for doing so. In terms of structural steel, which would be more interest to more of you, CE marking in 1090s Part 1 and 2 is not specific about reuse, but does allow for products not from a harmonised standard. In this instance, the specification is key, so you have to understand what the product is required to do in its application, as opposed to just asking for a particular product specification. And the products that are then used must have their properties both specified and proven. It's about fitness for purpose. There's no point in reusing something if it's not going to do the job that you need it to do. One of the things that's been a mantra for long enough for the steel industry as a whole, but also for the demolition industry and also as a get out of jail for a lot of construction, is that recycling happens to 95% of steel currently. And this is absolutely true. Steel is a magnificent material because it can be recovered so efficiently. But in fact, it's an even greater material than that because its properties don't deteriorate in general circumstance. So a piece of steel protected from corrosion will maintain its performance properties essentially forever. If you recycle, then you're saving 70% of the carbon versus new. If you reuse, then you're saving basically an agreed 95-96% of carbon versus new. Bearing in mind that we're already recycling at 95%, recycling isn't giving us an answer for the net zero targets for 2050 because it's the solution that we already have, which means that we can't really improve on it. This means that reuse offers us a 30% carbon reduction against the current status quo, and that's one of the big reasons why it's attractive. What is reuse? This might seem obvious, but I wanted to just lay it out because the sustainability arena is full of terminologies and we get an awful lot of them mismatched and misused, and it's very important to understand the right words in the right context, or use the right words in the right context, particularly when talking to clients and suppliers. Reuse is material that is used again. That sounds blindingly obvious, but it means that it was at the very least produced for one application and is subsequently going to be used in another. A more practical definition for those of us involved is material that is diverted from waste. And the reason I mention that is because if you were going to throw it in the skip, then its carbon has been consumed on the job in question, whether you've used it or whether you haven't. And it does mean that new material can be considered as reused or repurposed or basically counted for as a carbon saving. So in terms of the types of reuse, very quickly, we've got reuse as in the original structure or the original component. So you're literally taking a column and using it to hold something else up. You've got repurposing, where you may take, in our instance, oil material, oil pipelines, and use it for props and piles and structural sections in buildings. Upcycling and downcycling, which does take account of things like crushing concrete. And then you've actually got downpurposing, which doesn't really serve a purpose in this case because you're taking a material to make it do the job of another. The recycling we've already discussed, and that's the case where this thing will run on and gain no benefit if we just chase recycling indefinitely. In terms of getting a start in reuse on a project, you've got very much a developing market. So we've been selling tubes for years. That's an understood market for piling, for propping, and for certain structural applications. In terms of steel sections and other products, the market is currently only developing. In order to get benefit from reuse, you need to be flexible in the design requirements. So if you specify S355J20 steel grade, then that's the only thing people will be able to input on the project. If you specify performance criteria, it may well be the case that other grades and other materials can be used. If you want to get a start in reuse, don't go for an all or nothing solution. It's not practical to decide you want your entire high-rise or stadium to be built out of reused materials today. They're not there to use. Therefore, accommodate reuse within it, but accept that new product is clearly going to be part of that solution. The other thing, because there is a market issue, is to look at what assets you already have. A lot of clients, a lot of contractors already have access to pools of material. Make sure you know what you've got available within your existing portfolio, your existing sites, and then see if you can use them on other projects or on the project that you're on. Very classically, if you're demolishing a building, what's already in it that you might be able to be using again. There's an awful lot of stuff gets taken down that's really not very old, which means that a lot of that material is in good condition and also of relevant grades, etc. This is something that's already happening. I'm aware of several live projects currently, and it's happening more and more all of the time. We're hearing now from demolition contractors as well as clients that want reused material going in. So the pressure's coming at all aspects of the supply chain, in my experience. I don't want to major on this, but the Steel Construction Institute, in conjunction with ourselves, or at least we paid for it, produced the Structural Steel Reuse Protocol, which basically will talk people through what's required in order to make sure you have specified the material correctly, proved its fitness for purpose, and then used it in the structure in a manner which is acceptable, insurable, etc., etc. Some instances of where this has been seen. The big one that we always hang our hat on was the London Olympic Stadium, where there were more than 2,000 tonnes of disused oil and gas pipe went into the Olympic Stadium. It gave them greater than 4,000 tonnes of carbon saving, albeit ironically, it was quoted as the greenest games, but in fact, as to the best of my knowledge, none of the calculations were ever done. But this was a job that was able to benefit from the oil industry waste to save carbon in a very prestigious building and project. To be more specific, we did a project ourselves in 2019, NTS, one of our sister companies. We actually bought a frame at auction, been produced in 2012. The project had been cancelled. It had been 2008, I think, actually, project cancelled during the financial crash. So it'd been laid around till 2012. We then had it laid around for longer. We then took that frame, modified it, and created a whole new building from it. We strengthened columns, we added bays, basically reworked the frame to make sure it did what we needed it to do, and allowed for future expansion. We were able on that project to also use road planings, which is downcycling, but we were able to use road planings instead of hardcore, and we diverted an awful lot of the waste soil spoil to local agricultural applications. In doing all of that, it was calculated that we saved thousands of tonnes of carbon, really a lot of carbon altogether, but also more interestingly, we saved almost £1 million in cost on the building. So there are double benefits fundamentally to sustainability. Not only are you going to have the carbon benefits, if it's done correctly in the right applications, you can also save money, which is going to ring bells with a lot of people in the first instance. So there are a couple of quite specific examples. I just want to spend a minute or two at the end of the presentation talking about ourselves and also put in context. So from our point of view, we're interested in pipe. The oil industry historically has generated huge volumes of pipe for usage, but then also for surplus, downgrade and used pipe materials. In terms of cancelled projects, in terms of unused surpluses, these do cast for carbon savings, because if they were created for a project and don't have a specific market application after the event, then the official carbon accounting takes account of the carbon on the project and the surplus material is reduced carbon. And to put it in context for volume, I'm currently aware of 3 cancelled projects for pipe, one of which is 2/3 of a million tonnes, one of which is 1/3 of a million tonnes, and one of which is 60,000 tonnes. So there's oil pipe that has been produced, which now doesn't have a home to go to, because oil pipes are specific and bespoke to the oil industry, but are able to be utilised in construction if people are adaptable with their designs and their specifications for grades, etc. Used material was much more commonplace. There's still amounts of it in the casing industry, and that's often used in micropiling and general piling applications, but it's less normal because the market turned away from it in the 2000s with the advent of CE marking, etc. The good news is that there are in fact over 500,000 tonnes of ex-oil pipes available in Europe for people that can use pipe to look to reduce their carbon footprint. Cleveland Steel ourselves, we've been established for 45 years. We've got over 75,000 tonnes of pipe in stock currently, 100% traceable. Some of the surplus material still has the original production certificates available. We are able to offer value-added services, processing, etc., to execution class 3. Certainly execution class 2 without any dramas. So we are able to offer materials to projects that require pipe work. 80,000 tonnes is a big footprint. We're sitting on over 100 acres. Takes a bit of handling the material, but there you go. So as previously stated, we have welding and fabrication, painting, and more than 70,000 tonnes, 75,000 tonnes of stock, which in the current climate is important because people need to know the materials available to do the job. The range of materials starts from, I think we have 20 millimetre diameter all the way up to 2.5 metre diameter, thicknesses from 1.6 millimetres to over 250 millimetres. And you can see on the slide, we've got materials that have had to be recovered from being coated. We've got materials there you can see that we've taken samples from to prove the quality and grade of the material. This is all standard fodder for us. So I thank you for your time. I hope it's been helpful outlining the sustainability issues. And if anybody has a requirement for pipe, and as we go forward, also for sections, we're establishing a stock of sections. And I'm more than happy to provide advice to people just on steel reuse and sustainability issues if they have questions. I've done quite a lot of that in the last 12 or 18 months as well. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Roy. That was a great, really eye-opening presentation, and I'm pleased to say you're here with us live. So if anybody's got questions they'd like to put to Roy, now's the time to put them into the chat function on Swapcarve. At the end of that presentation, Roy, you spoke about, obviously tubes is a big part of your business, but about steel sections in general. What's the picture there? Especially, I mean, there's all sorts of supply problems in steel in the industry. Can you help people with that side of things?
We're starting to establish an inventory of sections. The irony is that in 2012 we had an inventory, but CE marking meant that the industry stopped buying them. So we've had a sort of 10-year period where the supply has basically disappeared, except to the smaller end users. So there is still niche markets for reused steel into farming would be the very obvious example, but a few other places. So we're currently trying to re-establish an inventory, but scrap prices are against us at the moment because they're very high, which means a lot of people are just very happy to see the material go out for a good return to scrap.
And obviously, we saw in your presentation quite substantial yards there with material. Presumably, you can get that stuff on site pretty quickly if people need steel for things like piling and what have you.
No, absolutely. It's really just dependent on the processing that the client requires us to do, so we can do the welding and the painting, etc. But the material itself can usually be loaded out in 24, 48 hours if it's virgin material to go straight out. In some instances, there may be decoating and things, but no, we have got 75,000 tonnes of inventory, so it's usually possible to get stuff out pretty quickly. And even with the fabrication, it's unusual for us not to be able to start within a couple of weeks, and then it just depends on the size of the job.
Yeah, well, given the supply constraints in some other materials, I'm sure people will be delighted to hear that. Is there still something of a stigma around using recycled material? Is that something you see amongst clients, perhaps?
Yes, 100%. We've had a number of instances where we've asked to be able to use live cases as case studies and been declined from the client end because although the material's on the job, they don't want to broadcast the fact. I've seen a huge swing just this calendar year in attitudes to the circular economy and sustainability. So I'm expecting all of this will start to change, and really very quickly based on the current pace of change. It's just a question now of supporting the market and making sure we get this so that it's happening much more routinely and get it sort of hammered out so that people are comfortable with it. There's no issue with steel performing, and it's very easy to validate its properties and prove them. So there's no logical reason to stand in the way it is, as you say, just a perception problem.
Yeah, well, hopefully, as sustainability becomes more of a concern for more and more people throughout the industry, from clients on down all the way through the supply chain, perhaps it will become more of a badge of honor that you're using recycled stuff, and that perhaps will be good news for your business. One of the questions I'm sure people come to you with frequently is how can they be assured of the quality and the consistency of what they get if it's had a previous life? How do you make sure that what you're sending out onto site is consistent?
In the first instance, you ensure that you know its pedigree. So you've got to know where it's come from. If it's a batch of material, that it's all from a similar batch. And then the big advantage of steel is it can be tested. So we can carry out non-destructive and destructive tests, which will prove the properties. You can re-inspect welds if welds exist. You can pretty much, well, not pretty much, you can actually validate all of the things that a mill produces. The only difference between procuring it through this route and from a mill is that we can't be certified as a producer. So you have to determine the sample level yourself, whereas theirs are set out in the standards of production. But the things that you need to look at can all be done outside the production environment.
And you're sourcing a lot of your stock from the oil industry. I imagine they've got pretty exacting standards, haven't they? I mean, they don't muck about. That's a high consequence business if they have failures in their tubes.
No, absolutely. I mean, a lot of our material is surplus material, so it's been destined for scrap because it's been left over on large jobs. If you make 1,000-kilometre pipeline, having a kilometre left over is a big heap of pipe that isn't significant to the job. That pipe will have been produced to very high standards, including tests that aren't required for construction. And that's how the business model developed, because you're taking actually a superior product and using the modern parlance, down-purposing it in essence. If it's a question of it being second-hand or reused, then clearly you're just repurposing it. But again, one would imagine it didn't go into the original application defective. There seems to be a strange perception of that somehow the building that you've taken down may have been built out of something incredibly dodgy in the first place. And I have no idea why that perception comes from, because there's really no evidence to back it up.
Well, as I say, hopefully as we move forward and more people take sustainability seriously, that kind of knowledge about that kind of preconception will spread, and more people will realise the benefits. That's all the time we've got for this session, Roy. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. Fascinating stuff. I'd never thought about the quantity of steel that was recycled and how we can't really make much progress on that if we're already 95% of it recycled. So some fascinating insights there.